Okay, so I want to make a film review. Like I said, I'd start doing that with films I watch. I've missed one or two, but anyway, the latest film I've watched, literally just come back from the cinema, was Selma. Um, so with these reviews, I want to make it clear this is just my opinion. It's not, yeah, I'm not sort of telling anyone else what to think or whatever, but it's my opinion about the film and about the issues around it. This is exactly the sort of film that is down my street, so to speak. I'm fascinated by history, by social movements, by political movements. So it's precisely the sort of film that does interest me. And of course, therefore, I had to see it. I think it's the fourth film I've watched in a row connected with the subject of African Americans and civil rights. The Butler was one. 12 Years a Slave was another, and there was one more which I forget right now. But um, all films connected in some way to the civil rights movement. I'd seen trailers for this, and it looked very interesting. I have to say, being British, I'm quite proud of the fact that we have a very big lineup in the film. In fact, pretty much all the principal roles are taken up by British actors. David Oyelowo, I practiced that name a few times, David Oyelowo, thanks to Brad Pitt, played Martin Luther King. Tom Wilkinson played Lyndon Johnson. Carmen Ejogo played Coretta Scott King. Some other leading roles: Andre Holland was Andrew Young. Tim Roth played George Wallace. Dylan Baker, J. Edgar Hoover. Coleman Domingo was Ralph Abernathy. But at least half of the main roles there are played by British actors, and I have to say I'm quite proud of that fact. It shows this has nothing to do with the subject matter of the film, of course, but it shows that this country still has a very big acting talent pool. So I'm proud of that fact. I think it goes without saying that for any actor to take on the role of such a monumental historical figure as Martin Luther King takes a certain degree of courage to take on that sort of role. I have to say, without bias, I think he was great at the role. Whatever you think of the film, I think his role as King. I've seen Martin Luther King speeches, I've seen video recordings. It's uncanny. He looks like him, he sounds like him. You would not think this guy's from London. It's incredible. I think he's from London, I should say. But that's incredible. And Carmen Ejogo plays Coretta Scott King. She was perfect at that role. And she's done it before, incidentally. Tim Roth, great as George Wallace. If you haven't seen this film, I recommend it. If you think that it's... One thing I would say, though, is don't go in with a preconceived idea that it's overly sentimental. It's not. It doesn't eulogize King in a way that sort of he's perfect, or he's... it doesn't marbleize him, to put it one way, and that is a good thing. It shows he has human weaknesses. It shows that he was a womanizer. There's a few scenes in the film which focus on that. By the way, before I continue, I should say these film reviews are always going to be spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film, stop watching this video now, because I am going to talk about details of the film. So that's just, spoiler alert. Some of the things that I've seen on trailers, not that I'm influenced by other people's opinion, but I still find it interesting. There's quite a lot of criticism as well. The criticism seems to stem from the fact that people are sort of like, oh, it's yet another civil rights film. That's coming from the notion that there's a lot of films out there. Well, it's true, there is a lot of films based on the subject of civil rights. Just off the top of my head, you have Mississippi Burning, you have In the Heat of the Night, you have The Butler, focused quite in large part about this, although it also focused on other things. There's quite a lot of films covering the civil rights era. Another very powerful film I saw would be 7 years ago now, set at that time, although about another figure, Bobby Kennedy, was the film Bobby. That's another film that really moved me, and this is, I have to admit, there's only a handful of films that get me really moved. I've quite tough skin insofar as I'm not, You know, it takes a lot to really move me, but this one, you know, it's a very powerful film. And the film Bobby had that effect as well. It was about the people in the Ambassador Hotel on the night RFK was assassinated. This film had that sort of effect. There were a few bits in the film that were, if I was to give any critique, there was a few moments that were slightly slow moving. So the pace wasn't quite consistent. There was moments where there was a lot of action and it was quite fast moving. Then there were other moments where there was a little bit of perhaps too much dialogue, but you know, I don't want to criticise too much. Actually, I should say the director of this film, someone called Ava DuVerney. I have to be honest, I haven't heard of her, but you know, if this is one of her first films, she's going to go a long way. It's a fantastic film. She's a young director, only 40, and yeah, if this is, you know, if this is her first major film, I think she's going to go a long way. So Ava DuVerney is the director. But just to get back to the criticism, people are saying, oh, it's yet another civil rights film. There's particular criticism of Oprah Winfrey. She has a role in the film as one of those sort of registering to vote. In fact, if you bear with me a second, I'll just find the exact character she's playing. It's not a major role that she has, but it's a relatively important role. No? No, she's not credited. I thought she was... maybe I'm getting her mixed up with someone else. I'm sure that Oprah Winfrey had a role in this film, but I guess... Nope, she does. Annie Louie Cooper. She plays Annie Louie Cooper, who was a woman who registered to vote. This was the whole film, by the way. The title Selma is based around the Selma voting rights movement of 1965. You know, I think it would be almost impossible to make a film focusing on the entire civil rights movement from, let's say, Rosa Parks till King's assassination, because that covers a long time. It would be absolutely impossible to cover everything. So some people criticise the fact that this was focusing just on the Selma issue, but if you try to cover everything, it's very difficult. The opening of the film showed the brutal murder of 4 young girls in, I believe it was in Birmingham, Alabama, when their church was blown up by white supremacists. It's a very shocking scene. It's not necessarily graphic and bloody, but it does take you off guard. So the whole focus on the film is King's march from Selma to Montgomery. I find it very interesting too, because it shows a lot of the background of what's going on in terms of King's tensions with President Johnson. The fact that Johnson, you know, Johnson in the film comes across as quite a complex character. You get the impression on one hand he's not doing enough, on the other hand he's trying his level best in the position that he's in terms of the constitutional position that he is in. So you know, it's this film doesn't sort of marbleize any character or demonize any individual. Perhaps, I mean, okay, it doesn't exactly present Jim Clark in a good light. He was the mayor, I believe, of Selma. You know, he just comes across as a thug. Tim Roth, well, playing George Wallace, he's not presented in a good light, but you know what? That's history. It's very hard to find much praise for someone like George Wallace, who was a hardcore segregationist. There are people who question why make a film like this. All it's doing is stirring up racial tensions. America right now, I think it's fair to say, is not that tranquil in terms of race relations. You know, this film is coming in the wake of Ferguson, coming in the wake of the Eric Garner protests. There is still serious issues out there. Certainly not comparable to the 60s, but you know, there are people who will say, oh, all this film is doing is stirring up tension. I disagree. I don't think any country should hide from its past. So the civil rights movement and everything that came with that is simply a historical fact. So, you know, I don't think directors should steer away from it just from fear, oh, well, it's going to offend some people. It's just a historical fact. This is American history. This is what happened. I've seen also criticisms from some African Americans saying, why does it always have to be about victimhood? Well, I agree. It's not it's not healthy to always think in terms of victimhood, but I don't agree that this is about victimhood. In fact, if you see the film, it shows the courage of the civil rights marchers. Another good thing about the film, which I really welcome, is that it is a very objective film insofar as it isn't the blacks versus the whites. It doesn't simplify anything like that. In fact, it shows several young white priests and a young white woman, and they were historical characters. Admittedly, I'd not heard of them before, but they play important roles. Jeremy Strong plays Reverend James Reeb, and I'm just looking at the credits here from Wikipedia. Tara Ox plays Viola Liuzzo. They were northern whites who came to the South, heeding Martin Luther King's call. They risked their life, and in both cases, they were killed, murdered, by, in the case of Viola Liuzzo, by the Ku Klux Klan. So that shows that, you know, this wasn't just token gesturism from white liberals, and I disregard the term white liberals because I believe this was a truly universal movement. I believe people across the board supported this. I'm sure there were American conservatives in their heart and soul believe they knew it was wrong and they supported it. So I think it's a little bit of a caricature just to say it was liberals that supported civil rights. I mean, Martin Luther King wasn't exactly as left-wing as some make him out to be. You know, this was a widespread universal movement. Also, Malcolm X makes a brief appearance. And if you've seen the film Malcolm X, the Spike Lee film Malcolm X, that is an interesting background because it shows Malcolm X is also an interesting character. He certainly started off with black supremacist movement, but like I say, that was a response to, it was sort of in tandem with Martin Luther King's movement, sort of saying, well, not in tandem, but at the same time saying that King's pacifism wasn't working. But Malcolm X is an interesting character because he then saw that the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam went too far. For example, they demonized all white people, and he tried to reach out. Unfortunately, he paid with it with his life as well. So there was also an internal struggle going on within the black movement, within the black community at this time, and it got me thinking about, you know, I have to admit there's some scenes in the film when I saw old men and women being beaten by these thugs, the Alabama State Troopers, or, you know, the human side of me thought, how can, you know, your human instinct would be to fight back. And it got me thinking also about pacifism, because I believe that, I'm not a pacifist, I'll say that from the outset. I have enormous respect for people like Martin Luther King and Aung San Suu Kyi and Mahatma Gandhi, but the idea of pacifism does need to be debated because there are some circumstances, and okay, I'm getting a little bit off track here, but I went to a documentary showing a few nights ago about the Arabian Spring, and there were some young Syrian guys there, and they were obviously quite emotional about it because this was showing hardcore war footage from their homeland, and you know, some of them made the very valid point that when you're dealing with a brute force, pacifism just doesn't work. They were referring to the Assad regime. And that can be applied, I think, to any struggle. So, people like Martin Luther King and Aung San Suu Kyi have to be admired for their courage, but the question is, is it always the right approach? I mean, look at South Africa. Mandela did initially take that approach, then he said, this is fickle, it's not working. You know, what is the point of pacifism if all it results in is a truncheon every time? And I actually agree with that principle. I don't believe in universal pacifism. I believe there are times when force is the only answer. So the question is, to what extent did Martin Luther King's approach of pacifism achieve everything that has been achieved to this day? I would say that King, as a unifying force, was extremely important, but Mandela was also a unifying force. Mandela didn't demonize white people. Mandela also realized that to have a democratic South Africa, you needed a universal approach. That's why I'm very critical of black power movements today and black supremacist movements today, because I think they offer nothing to society. But I do understand why they grew up in the early 60s, mid 60s, because they saw Martin Luther King's approach as being pointless, as being fickle. Now, I don't, I'm not going to get into the sort of debate about which approach was right. I think what was wrong with the likes of the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers is their argument was, we're going to do this alone, and all white men are evil. That was just a narrow outlook that was completely opposite of King's perspective, and actually very offensive when you consider the white civil rights activists who risked their lives to do the right thing. I would like to think that if I was around then, I would have the courage to join in those marches. I've been in a few demonstrations in my lifetime. I've been in a few marches, political demonstrations, but nothing where I've faced serious violence. Nothing comparable to that. So I would like to know in my heart and soul that I would have the courage to do what I thought was right. But anyway, without going off on a tangent, I do think the film is important, and to me it's a very good film. I can't see any major reason to criticise that film, because it doesn't sort of, it's not sycophantic. It doesn't make King out to be perfect. It doesn't make any of the civil rights people out to be, these saintly figures who just took all this violence without, having human emotions, without anger, without fear. There's one scene where one of them goes to get rifles because he's had enough. Now, to me, that's an entirely human response. And admittedly, if I was seeing my parents beaten, if I was seeing women beaten, if I was seeing children beaten, yeah, would I be pacifist? I don't think so. I really, really don't think so. So, yeah, it's a real thinking film, but it's like I said, there's a few moments in the film that's a little bit slow moving, and that would be my only criticism. But considering this is the first major film of this director, I would say it's a great film. I really think it is a very moving film. And if you haven't seen it and you have preconceived ideas about it, if you get a chance, I just recommend seeing it. It's not a black and white film, so to speak. It isn't like, it doesn't present a simple case of good versus evil, because it shows, for example, Johnson's dilemma as president, that there's one powerful scene where he says, you've got this one big issue, I've got 101 big issues. And it shows there was real tension between Johnson and King. Also, it shows that the CIA were spying on King. They thought he was a communist. But it's just a very interesting film. If you're someone who's interested in social history, interested in that sort of thing, I strongly recommend it. I'm going to close this up soon, but a few more words I would like to say about pacifism. I've been in debates with, with pacifist people. My stance on pacifism, and I'm going to make other videos about this because it's a very important issue. On one hand, I've a huge amount of respect for pacifists. I think it must take a massive amount of inner courage and restraint to have to face that sort of bigotry and vicious racism, and any sort of injustice for that matter, and still not respond with force. Pacifism, though, isn't, we shouldn't think that pacifism is the same as appeasement. Sometimes it is, though, and that's where I have a problem with it. I don't think there's any moral high ground in pacifism if it is the position of doing nothing. And this is why I have a problem with sort of Ron Paul ideology of it's their problem, let's ignore it, in terms of foreign policy. And I'm getting into other realms here, but the simple question about pacifism is this: if you are being attacked, does it make any sense to do nothing? And when I say do nothing, I'm talking about force. If someone's coming at you with a truncheon, are you going to sit there and take it, not fight back? Well, maybe the practical answer would be yes, because if you do, you'll get your head smashed in. But the point I want to make is that aggression, self-defense, are entirely human. Pacifism is a very powerful thing, but I'm just not convinced that it is universally the morally right thing. Sometimes I think it is outright wrong. You cannot, because there are simply forces out there you cannot negotiate with. And I know there's an argument that, well, it's not about negotiation, you say no, but there are times that force is the only way. In fact, some of the most famous pacifists, or people well known for pacifism, actually are open-minded enough to recognize it isn't always workable. I think it was the Dalai Lama said, the best way to respond to a bully is with a fist. He didn't say turn the other cheek. In fact, Gandhi, Aung San Suu Kyi, and other great figures of all, there were complex people. In the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, she said something interesting. This was quoted at the beginning of the documentary I mentioned. She said, "I will never condemn those Burmese dissidents who decided to use violence," because she could understand it. In fact, she's from a military background. So she understood that some people believed that was the right thing to do, and she refuses to condemn them. So I respect pacifism insofar as I believe it takes enormous courage, and I believe sometimes it does work. But what I don't respect is some pacifists who try to dictate to others that they should also be pacifists. I don't think they've got any right to do that. If they believe that is the way they want to do things, okay. And I support conscientious objection in times of war, but I think pacifists also need to be aware that it is entirely human to use force in situations where there really is no other answer. And there are circumstances where the only way to stand up against evil is with force. A well-known example is World War II. The idea that Nazism could have simply just been criticised and condemned and then it would stop is absurd. And there's contemporary issues with this, especially involving Arabian Spring, but those issues are very, very complex, and there are no easy answers. And particularly Islamic State, for instance. And okay, I'm getting a little bit off tangent here, but it is a very important issue right now. There are some who say that bombing Islamic State won't solve anything. Well, I have a real dilemma with this in my thinking on the issue. I agree, probably it won't solve anything. You'll kill a few hundred of them, then a few hundred more will be recruited. But the alternative, not using force, what is the other option? Negotiating with them? Negotiating with their fascist ideology? Because the problem is, without using the same language that an organisation, that an ideology like that understands, then basically you become subservient. The only way to stand up to a bully is by reaching their level. And that's not to say that pacifism is weak, it's not. It's incredibly strong. But when you're dealing with the likes of Islamic State, showing restraint, what does that mean? It means allowing people to be enslaved by their ideology. Take Raqqa, for example, the town in northern Syria. And listen, I'm not talking about Western intervention here. I'm talking about, for example, Jordan or other countries involved in the region. What if they do nothing? Now, I don't blame Jordan at all for their bombing strikes. It may not help anything. But when you're dealing with a fascist ideology, negotiation means subservience. And I don't believe there's any moral weight in trying to negotiate with evil. But it has to be understood that not all pacifism is about that. Now, Martin Luther King's pacifism wasn't about negotiation. He demanded equality. He demanded that black people had the same rights as the white brothers and sisters. So I also believe you get different types of pacifism. The sort of pacifism I respect is King's pacifism, although personally I would struggle with it. If I had a black friend and I saw them being beaten by a racist white cop, I don't know if I could restrain myself. I really don't know. So I respect King's pacifism. Whether I agree with it or not, I don't know. I mean, it cost him his life. Also, there's other types of pacifism that I've no time for. I don't respect pacifism that is basically about, oh, war and violence is wrong, but we're going to be silent about dictatorship. And I have seen that sort of pacifism, most notably in the organisation Stop the War coalition here in Britain. The reason I don't endorse them is because they're inconsistent and because they condemn Western military power, but have nothing to say about Islamism. To me, that is rank hypocrisy. But anyway, I'm getting into wider issues here. This was mainly meant to be a review about the film Selma, and I've ended up talking about pacifism. If you have listened to me this long, thank you. Let me know your thoughts below. Yeah, these are all very important issues.